Look,
Yeah.
we've got Helen Clark on Skype, so let's cross to Helen now. Helen, what do you make of those numbers?
Absolutely phenomenal. This is a 1938 style election result, which isn't surprising in a way because we're dealing with the 1 in 100 year crisis with a pandemic. And Jacinda has led so well on that. And really, this is a night we could only have dreamed of, that she's led the Labor Party through to the most crushing victory.
So did COVID kill the National Party's chances?
I think the way they handled it killed it. If they'd embraced the response and instead of trying to continually find fault, they may have done better. It would have been hard anyway, but the way they handled it didn't help them.
You're obviously in high demand, so we're going to ignore the phone that's ringing in the background there, Helen. What can New Zealand expect with this enormous mandate? What should we expect from this Labor government?
Well, I think the first thing on everyone's mind is how do we go from here with the response to COVID? Because there's clearly no return to the kind of international tourism we had or the student numbers from offshore. And that accounted for around 25% of New Zealand's export dollar revenue. So it's not a small amount. So I think it's going to be how the government can lead and work across sectors to bring new sectors of the economy forward, because the old economy we're not going to see again.
Can we expect some transformation? Because some of the critics have said, obviously COVID was something that required enormous attention and enormous money. What about things like housing and welfare? What can we expect from a Labor government that can govern on its own in those areas where it's previously promised transformation?
So what I think is the way is now clear for the New Zealand Parliament to have a solid majority for legislating around the environment and the climate change response, solid majority around social inclusion, and housing is such a critical part of that. It's interesting that during the pandemic we found a way to house the homeless. That's got to be permanent. And the other area I have high hopes for is in the justice sector, because our prison numbers are a disgrace. You know, we're heading on a USA-style trajectory. That's not where we need to be. If we could have transformational thinking, Norwegian style, to get those prison numbers down and really have a justice system, I think that would be a major achievement from a government like the one we look like having.
So in terms of those ambitions and goals that this government may hold, is it a blessing then that Winston Peters and New Zealand First has not, it appears, made it back into Parliament?
So this is not Winston's night. The souffle has risen a number of times before, but not tonight. And I don't think, this is a time for people to be putting the boot in. Jacinda would never have got her opportunity to show what she offered New Zealand if Winston Peters hadn't opened the door to that with the agreement 3 years ago. Yes, clearly there's been a number of areas where New Zealand First has been difficult, and this justice penal policy and a number of them we can think of. But nonetheless, it enabled Jacinda to establish herself as a leader, and I think she'll always be grateful for that.
Helen, just because you can govern alone, should you? Or do you anticipate that Jacinda Ardern will be looking at, extending some kind of arrangement, agreement with the Greens?
I think so, and I think listening to Grant Robertson a bit earlier, you could see that was on the cards. I think, by and large, the Green ministers have done pretty well in the portfolios. They may prefer to stay outside the cabinet and be ministers outside cabinet and not in a formal coalition. That works quite well. But you're looking for the longer term relationships here. This is a very unusual election. 1938 couldn't be repeated the same way either. So looking for the longer term, I wouldn't be surprised to see the kind of arrangement that Labor currently has with the Greens carrying on.
So you're talking about an insurance policy for a third term. If you don't get these kind of unprecedented numbers, you need some friends.
It's an insurance policy. You need friends in politics. That was what the National Party discovered last time. They emerged the biggest party, but they didn't have any friends. And that doesn't deliver you government. So the smart thinking looks at how do you keep those links open for the longer term.
I know it's not your team, but as a political observer, what do you think was the biggest mistake that National made?
Well, I think the dial-a-leader changes in recent months. I mean, there's been a whole range of comment about this tonight, but it's hard to think that Simon Bridges could have done worse than this. They might have. Look, I was involved in a bit of this head rolling in 1990. It didn't really help us at all. And sometimes you just have to stick with the leader you've got and fight another day. Actually, in 1996, I wasn't looking too flash as a leader of the opposition either. And there were attempts to roll, but I hung in because I didn't think anyone else could do any better, and of course got my chance next time. So I think, sometimes instead of just automatically flicking leaders who are struggling for the moment, you need to look at the longer term potential.
You're not comparing Judith Collins to yourself, are you? No, yes, yeah. But in the sense that Judith Collins she was the underdog, arguably executed herself well in some of the debates. There's some parallels with the experience that you had in that as well.
Well, there is. And going into that first debate, the issue always was, would there be a Lazarus effect for Judith? I had a Lazarus effect in that first election when I was leader of the opposition in 1996. But I think this was a much more clear-cut election anyway. By the time we got into the campaign period, Labour was in a very strong position. And even a couple of, good debate performances from Judith, which they were, wasn't going to make the difference in the end.
Do you see a role for Winston Peters? What could he be? What could his job be? Is there a use for him within this government, even if he's not in Parliament as an MP? I think we've just frozen there. Oh, at the critical point, Corin.
Exactly.
We were
I want to know the answer to that.
If Helen Clark, maybe someone can pick her up from Skype and she just give us an answer over the phone.
What are you suggesting, Lisa? Perhaps an ambassador's role somewhere?
An ambassador's role or something like that, a statesman's
no question he's fond of the US, right? But I don't know whether there's a free spot going anytime soon.
And as the Foreign Minister, we've got Helen Clark back. Helen, I was just asking you, and we were just hanging on the edge of our desk here wondering, what role could you see for Winston Peters?
Well, first, I think the issue is for Winston to decide what sort of role he would want to play in New Zealand public life going forward. Will he try to run again? He's traditionally hasn't done so well when he's been in the government. He's tended to go out after a term of that. But, could there be a role? Maybe that's a discussion to be had. I mean, personally, I wouldn't, rule anything out because Winston's been a feature of our political life for so long that we're not used to him being on the stage somewhere. So, watch that space.
So when you've got such a large majority here, it means that Kelvin Davis is the Deputy Prime Minister. Is he up to the job?
Oh, yes. I think Kelvin has been underrated generally in media. Look, I've mentioned a couple of times the sort of justice and corrections portfolio areas. I saw Kelvin do absolutely everything he could to bring humanity to a penal system where the legislation is frankly completely against humanity. So I have high hopes for Kelvin showing what he can do in that role.
It also means that Jacinda Ardern is obviously in for a big shuffle in terms of her ministerial portfolios. We were just looking through the ministers' list before, and so basically she's lost about 8 ministers who came from either the Greens or from New Zealand First. Is there enough depth in her top people here? Because you seem to have ministers for everything, as in Chris Hipkins, heavy portfolios. Obviously, the other one was Andrew Little, Megan Woods, carrying big loads, and now you're losing some of the talent because those parties aren't in government with you anymore.
Well, I think there's a lot of talent on the backbench, and Labor's often been quite conservative. I certainly was in not bringing people straight into cabinet when they were elected. The one exception was Margaret Wilson, who I specifically recruited to be the Attorney General. So I think you've got people like Duncan Webb, Deborah Russell, Ginny Anderson, Kiri Allen, a whole lot of very talented people who've done a solid 3 years, and I would expect to see promoted.
Could you name us the Foreign Minister before you head off, Helen?
I think it needs to be a senior minister. Grant Robertson, of course, was once a New Zealand diplomat, but he's needed where he is. Andrew Little is senior and serious, so is David Parker. There's a range of them who could do it. Phil Twyford has a background working with Oxfam International and international development. So I think there's a range of possibilities.
Could he be resurrected into that position, though?
Oh, I would think so. Yeah, I mean, Phil Twyford has a passion for international affairs, but I have no idea what Jacinda's thinking, by the way. But I do think she's got a range of choices.
Have you spoken to her yet this evening?
I've sent a message. I haven't spoken to her.
Really appreciate your time this evening. That is Helen Clark, obviously former Labour leader and former Prime Minister.